Perfect. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Giada Sciarretta of the Bruno Kessler Foundation, and today I'm going to present you our formal analysis of mobile multi-factor authentication with a single sign-on experience. For this work, I collaborated with Luca Vigano of the King's College and my colleagues Roberto Carbone and Silvio Ranise from FBK. So let's start with some context. As you maybe know, passwords are recognized to be the weakest link in the authentication chain. To provide you an example, these are the 5 worst passwords of the last year. So to provide a way for the user to choose a complex password and access different services, a good design choice is to combine password-based authentication with a single sign-on solution. Why? Because in this way, the user does not need to create new password to access an application, and managing only one or few passwords, the user can select more complex password. And in addition, there is also the concept of shared sessions. So if a user has already a login session with an identity provider, then the user can access a new application without entering the credential anymore. However, there is also a drawback. As I told you, in this way, the user is using only one or few passwords to access several applications. So if this password is compromised, then the impact will be huge. So for some services like health application or financial services, a better design choice is to combine single sign-on with multi-factor authentication, where multi-factor authentication is a procedure that enhances the security of the authentication process by using 2 or more authentication factors. For example, combining a password that a user knows with a smart card that a user has, or for example, a fingerprint that is something that the user are. A multi-factor authentication procedure requires the generation of a one-time password that is an una tantum code with a short expiration that proves the possession of the OTP generator. There are different alternatives, different approaches for generating OTPs. In this workshop, we will focus on a time-based OTP approach, where the OTP is generating starting from a shared secret called seed and the time of the operation. But in general, there are other approaches. A widespread approach, for example, is a challenge response approach, where the server sends a challenge to the user, and the user has to answer with a valid response that is an OTP generating starting from the challenge and the private key that is stored locally in the user device. And FIDO is an example of a standard that is based on this approach. On the market, there are several solutions that provide multi-factor authentication. However, we couldn't find a clear and formal definition of the security property that a multi-factor authentication solution has to guarantee. And so a comparison between the different solutions could be misleading. For this reason, in this work recently published in the TOPS journal, we identify and formalize the threat model and security property of a multi-factor authentication solution, and then we formally analyze different multi-factor and single sign-on solution based on time-based OTP and challenge response approach. Despite the generality of our study, for concreteness, we develop our ideas in the context of 2 real use case scenarios. 3C, which involves mobile health applications and the use of a time OTP approach, and the second, which involves the Italian electronic identity card and a challenge response approach. During this workshop, as a running example, I will using the 3C scenario that was been presenting during the first OAuth security workshop. So let's describe this scenario. We have 4 entities: the patient, that is the user who wants to access her personal health record in the Tracee application. And the Tracee application, to authenticate the user, will interact with an external identity provider, ADC. And this provider will request the user to download an application called OTP path that generates an OTP. Before using this solution, two preliminary phases are required. First, the Tracee application has to register with the external identity provider, and this is to establish a federation. And then the patient has to activate the OTP application. And as a consequence of this phase, the external identity provider will share a seed value and a token used for providing the single sign-on experience. The seed value is stored locally by the OTP app, protected by with a PIN that is created by the patient during this phase. So after these two preliminary phases, the patient can actually use the Tracee application to access her personal health record. So the user will access the Tracee application, and the Tracee application will request the identity of the user to the OTP application. Now the OTP will forward this request to the identity provider, and the identity provider, given the parameters, will be able to check if Tracee is part of the federation, and if Tracee is part of the federation, will show to the user a consent form. And here, if the user agrees on sharing his data with the Tracee application, the OTP app will show a PIN request. After the entering of the PIN, the seed that is stored locally is unlocked and is used to generate an OTP that will be sent together with the token to the identity provider. With this value, so the identity provider will check these values, and if they are correct, it will build an authentication assertion containing the patient identity, and this assertion is sent back to the Tracee application. Together with the description of the Meson sequence chart, we have also identified a list of security assumptions that the solution must satisfy to avoid a violation of the basic authentication property. For example, we assume that the identity provider will release only valid identity assertion, and about the channel, for example, we assume that the communication between the OTP app and the external identity provider occurs over a unilateral TLS channel. So given this scenario, what we want to do is to evaluate it. So is it a good multi-factor authentication? For doing that, we need to define the threat model and the security property for a multi-factor authentication solution. So let's start with the expected security goal of a password-based authentication solution. That is, the service provider authenticates the user. Now, in the context of single sign-on, this is usually done using an authentication assertion that is released by the identity provider, like in the case of Tracee. Okay, so given this authentication goal, what does it mean to violate a multi-factor authentication? Let's consider again the Tracee scenario, and let's assume that there is a mobile thief that is able to steal the user's smartphone. In this case, the two values that are stored in the OTP application are compromised. However, the authentication goal is not violated because the mobile thief still needs to know the PIN value to perform the authentication. So in the case of Tracee, the PIN, the token, and the seed are security critical elements, And being specific instances of a classical authentication factor, we call them instance factors. Now, by generalizing this concept for a protocol with n instance factors, we can refine the security goal for a multi-factor authentication as follows. So, a service provider authenticates the user holds even if an attacker compromises up to n-1 instance factors. This means that in our analysis, we do not focus on attackers able to compromise all the instance factors. What we are going to check it is if there are attackers, even if some but not all the instance factors are compromised. To perform this analysis, we need first to define the threat model. And for doing that, we start from the NIST specification, and we identified a set of physical and software attackers. And then for each attacker, we have defined the operations that they can perform and a set of instance factors that they are able to explicitly compromise. About the operation, we distinguish 4 operations. So we have that an attacker could have the ability to know a knowledge factor. For example, a shoulder surfer attacker that is able to read the PIN value entered by a user. An attacker could have the ability to extract an ownership factor. For example, an authenticator duplicator that is able to duplicate the seed value. Then an attacker could have the ability to overhear messages sent by the user to an entity, like, for example, an eavesdropper attacker. And finally, an attacker could have the ability to interact with the entity in place of the honest one. We have seen the case of the mobile thief that is able to interact with the OTP application that is installed in the user smartphone. But in general, it could be also the case of a malicious application that interact with the other application on the smartphone, or for example, with the smart card that is put near the phone. Okay, so given this operation, we can derive the set of instance factors that are explicitly compromised by an attacker in a protocol. So considering again the mobile thief, we have seen that the mobile thief is able to interact with the OTP application that is installed in the user smartphone, and so is able to compromise the 2 ownership factors that are stored in this application. However, is not able to compromise the PIN. Only the combination, for example, of a shoulder surfer that is able to compromise a knowledge factor and the mobile device thief, then this combination is able to compromise all the instance factors. Okay, let's now see how we formalize these notions. So as a formal language of the mapping, we have used Aslan++, that is the input specification language of the Avansar platform. And for the analysis, we have used SATMC, that is a SAT-bounded model checker tool that, given an input, the system and the model of the system and the model of the intruder with its capabilities, is going to check whether the concurrent execution of different sessions of the system satisfy the expected security goal in spite of the presence of the intruder. And in particular, as a model checker problem, we have used this one, where G is an authentication goal. And for the other entity, we have M, that is the state transition system modeling the behavior of the entities. And this is how we translate this in Aslan++. So for each entity, we specify the set of messages that are sent and received by an entity. So for example, by considering the OTP app application, in the step 4 is sending a key hash value, and here you can see how we translate this. And for the initial knowledge, we use, for example, the I-knows fact to specify which values are known also by the attacker. This instead is how we formalize the security assumptions. As you can see, most of them are channel properties. For example, by considering again the TLS assumptions, we model it with 5 channel properties. And finally, we have modeled the attackers. And for doing that, we start from a Dole-Yao intruder that is built in the SATMC tool. And for modeling our threat model, we change the capability of a Dole-Yao intruder by adding initial knowledge or changing the channel properties. Okay, so we use this formalization for the threat scenario. And then by considering the set of attackers such that up to n-1 instance factor are explicitly compromised, we use SATMC. And for this scenario, SATMC did not find any attack on the solution. But this is not valid in general. Indeed, for example, in this scenario that involves an electronic identity card with a push notification system, we were able to detect an attack that is able to violate the authentication property by compromising only one instance factor. And this attack will be described in detail during the CodaSpy conference at the beginning of August. Here I will give you an idea. So we have a user who starts an authentication, so a login session with an online service. And the attacker in consideration is a man in the browser. This attacker is able to detect the ongoing operation and is able to perform the same request on his device. Now, in this protocol, the user will receive a push notification, but being the attacker man in the browser, is able to block the legitimate request, and only the malicious request will reach the user. Now the user is not able to detect the ongoing attack because he was expecting a push notification. So he will provide the PIN and it will interact with the electronic identity card. At the end of this, the attacker is logged as the user and the user will receive an error message. We classify this kind of attack as implicit attack because the attacker is able to deceive the user to finalize the process. So to conclude, we have formally defined a set of attackers based on the operations and set of instance factors that they are able to explicitly compromise. And then based on this notion, we refine the security property for a multi-factor authentication. Based on this formalization, we formally analyze different solutions based on different OTP approaches. And this led us to classify 2 different types of attackers. So we can have explicit attacks where an attacker is able to compromise explicitly all the instance factor, while we can have also implicit attacks where the attacker is not able to compromise all the factor, but still is able to deceive the user to finalize the process. As future work, we plan to study other multi-factor single sign-on solutions, for example, based on OpenID Connect and FIDO. And then we want also to combine our security analysis with risk assessment analysis. Okay, so this concludes my presentation. Here you can find more details about our research, and I'm available for any questions.
Okay, so thank you very much. So, are there questions from the audience?
I have a question, Daniel, here. What do you think would be something that's missing from your model that could improve the accuracy of your results?
Sorry, you ask what is missing that can improve the analysis?
Yeah. So from the threat model, for example.
Yeah, for sure the threat model can be improved because, as I told you, we started from 2 reference model. So the threat model can be improved by adding new attackers with different capabilities. Okay, for example, in this case, so for Trachi, the man in the browser was missing, but then in another scenario, we realized that we need it. So for each scenario, we can improve our threat model and understand if the properties, the channel properties, and that we define are enough to model also this new attacker. So yes, for each scenario, I think that the formalization can improve. And also for the moment, we are considering only instance factor for of knowledge and ownership. In the future, we can and we want to use also inherence factor. So we will add, for example, a fingerprint duplicator or other attacker able to compromise inherence factors.
Okay, thanks.